Very
good.
Thank you. Success.
I exist.
Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you to everyone in our audience. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Octavian Report. For those of you who are new to us, the Octavian Report is a nonprofit publication that features expert analysis of geopolitics, culture, and economics. We publish a newsletter to Substack, about 3 times a week, as well as a print magazine 4 times a year. If you're not yet a subscriber, I'm going to make a plug for you to join our growing community. Just go to octavian.substack.com, and my partner in crime, Richard Hurwitz, our founder and publisher, has just put that link in the chat. Today's event is open to everyone, but future events will be limited to subscribers. So subscribing now is the best way to ensure you don't miss out on anything we do. I'm very excited to introduce our guest, who you can now see. As Russia's isolation has increased in the days since it first invaded Ukraine, the role of China has grown ever more important. But China has also become much more isolated in recent years, which has made figuring out how Beijing actually thinks and what it wants extremely difficult. One of the few people I know who actually understands Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership is Kevin Rudd. Not only was he a former foreign minister and prime minister of Australia, he's also a fluent Mandarin speaker, an ex-diplomat, the current president of the Asia Society, and a top authority on China's leadership. So we're very lucky to have him. Here's how this is going to work. Kevin is in such demand today that we're going to keep this to about 45 minutes. I'm going to ask him some questions to start. You in the audience can send in your questions at any point by using Zoom's Q&A feature. When you type in your question, just be sure to give us your full name and where you're joining us from, as well as the question. Okay, Kevin, let's get started. U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping had a video call this morning. This comes just a few days after U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met his Chinese counterpart in Rome. Did anything important come out of today's meeting that you're aware of, and can you share it with us?
Yeah, good to join you, Jonathan. The readouts so far are public readouts, both on the Chinese side and the American side. And so it's difficult at this stage to get a clear handle on what transpired in the detail of the transaction over 2 hours. However, what we do know is that from the American side, the principal objective was to convey 3 messages to Xi. Number 1, do not get into the business of violating existing American allied financial and economic sanctions against Russia. Otherwise, action will be taken against Chinese institutions and possibly the Chinese state, that is, in the financial domain. Number 2, do not fool around with providing the Russians with military equipment. If that occurs, get ready for a fundamental rewrite of everything that's left of the U.S. China strategic relationship. And number 3 is, if you, Xi Jinping, believe that Putin is not doing well, as we in the collective West believe he is not doing well, then it's time for China to at least stop pretending to be on the fence and to get in the business of talking Putin down from the edge. And that would be a useful contribution. The role of China as a mediator between Ukraine and Russia, I think, is grossly overblown. The Ukrainians have long had an interest in China, as it were, mediating and therefore moderating the Russian position. But so far, 4 weeks almost into this war, Xi Jinping has yet to pick up the telephone to President Zelensky, whereas his contacts with President Putin have been extensive and wide-ranging.
So let's unpack that a little bit by stepping back and talking for a minute about what China wants the most out of its relationship with Russia and how, if at all, this crisis is affecting that.
There are deep Chinese interests alive in the Russia relationship. The most basic, of course, is to preserve the stability of the Russia-China border and the overall relationship, And that's been an unfolding project over the last 30 years. It's accelerated in the last 10 years under Xi Jinping, but it's a long-standing project. The reason for that is not just China's own security, but the reason for that, furthermore, is to enable China to focus exclusively on its maritime periphery and its principal engagement with its largest strategic adversary, namely the United States, both regional and locally. Beyond that, I think what we could say is that at the personal level, Xi Jinping believes that he has found a common soul in Vladimir Putin. Both see themselves as men of history, but uniquely as men of history without, frankly, a massive conflict between them territorially, but in fact a common adversary in the United States and a common distaste for democratic color revolutions domestically. So aggregate that, and that actually underpins the Xi Jinping/Chinese state's view of its deep interest in preserving the Russia relationship.
Now, has this crisis so far changed China's calculus at all?
The Chinese, like the rest of the world, have been surprised and, in my judgment, stunned by the poverty of the Russian military advance. The Blitzkrieg, as we know, has failed. And beyond that, we also know that the sustainability of the military effort on the ground in Ukraine has caused the Chinese to worry. Secondly, what's caused the Chinese to worry domestically has been the extent to which the brutality of the Russian military invasion and China's, frankly, tacit support for it, because it's refused to condemn it or even describe it as an invasion, and it's abstained in the relevant resolutions before the United Nations, both in the Security Council and in the General Assembly. The Chinese have now looked at the reverberating effect which their alignment with Russia has created in terms of European unity and European reaction for the first time significantly against China on security policy questions. By China injecting itself into a Russian worldview in Europe, whereby China has taken a position that NATO expansion, for example, it's something it should be committed to preventing. And I think the final concern which the Chinese have is the risk to the global economy coming out of this, because when you've got rapidly escalating energy prices, compounding global inflation, and therefore retarding global growth, on top of all the pre-existing headwinds against global economic recovery, the lingering impact of the COVID pandemic and other factors as well, including supply chains and decoupling left, right, and center, slowing Chinese economic growth when their growth rate was already slowing for domestic policy reasons is not a welcome development for the Chinese system. But in aggregate, Jonathan, if I put all these factors together, the next logical question would be, well, when is Xi going to move in order to rein Putin in? Answer, it would have to get a whole lot worse first, in my judgment, for a substantive move to be made. Xi would have to be concluded that Putin was in parlous military danger in Ukraine, or that he was in parlous political trouble in Moscow.
I want to unpack a couple of things you just said. First, as you mentioned, the both U.S. China meetings this week have involved this reported request from Russia to China for more both military aid and non-military aid. On the military side, it's quite surprising because, of course, we generally think of China as a consumer of Russian arms, not a supplier. So what do you make of the fact that this request came, and how could China help Russia on the military end if it wanted to?
I think it's to do, Jonathan, with the quantum of available kit and equipment that's sitting there in the warehouse at the moment, as opposed to what Russia has sitting in its own military warehouses. Secondly, you're right about the cross-pollination of military technologies. in fact, one of the great standing Russian complaints about the Chinese is that they buy one MiG aircraft, then re-engineer the avionics, and then the Chinese produce MiG+1 in the Chinese Air Force with 1,000 planes rolling off the production line. China also has indigenously produced military technologies which don't depend on Russian systems. I think it is the quantum of available kit and equipment as a matter of emergency and urgent need in the Russian battlefield. But I think the Chinese military and political leadership will be acutely conscious of now, particularly as a result of President Biden's call, but I think the robust exchange between Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and his nearest Chinese equivalent, Yang Jiechi, in Rome the other day. The Chinese will know that this will never be invisible. If you provide military gear, guess what? What we call national intelligence means tends to find that out pretty quickly in the 21st century. It's not like the days of the Bolshevik Revolution. You'd stick it in the hold of a boat somewhere and landed at Sevastopol and mysteriously would appear sometime later. No longer possible. So therefore, it would reverberate around the world, and the collateral damage in terms of Europe would be formidable. Therefore, would the Chinese consider it? I think they'd debate it internally, but I'm not prepared to make a call as to what they would do.
What about non-military support in the form of either trade or aid? Of course, the Russians now are under these intense sanctions, but one area of their economy that wasn't sanctioned is their energy industry. Do you expect to see more either Chinese economic transactions with Russia or any kind of direct financial support?
What is interesting for those who follow this forensically, which I do not, is that as of now, there is no clear-cut case of an active financial sanctions violation by Chinese corporations against the US and allied sanctions regime. And that's because China legitimately and logically believes that it is deeply exposed on this front if secondary sanctions were to be imposed against itself. Despite the size of the economy, the truth is the renminbi is not a global currency. It represents perhaps 4% of global currency reserves. It's not readily tradable. And the Chinese capital account has never been opened. So for those reasons, it's still vulnerable and captured within the global financial system to dollar-denominated transactions by and large. So China is deeply concerned about the pressures applied in its direction on that front. So therefore, I don't think they'll move there. Militarily, I make a judgment that they would be constrained for similar reasons, because I think the United States would probably move in the direction of a parallel sanctions regime. But there are ways in which you can get around this. And I think there's 2 or 3 areas where the Chinese will be of assistance. Direct financial transfers from one state to the other, that is. Secondly, as you inferred in your question, Jonathan, bringing forward commodity purchases, oil, gas, wheat, early, paying for them up front, even though they won't be delivered until much later in the process. And then finally, ongoing diplomatic and political support below the radar, which the Chinese are currently engaged in as they engage in capitals around the world, particularly in the G77, to lessen the international support for the current sanctions regime.
Now, as you know better than most of us, China never gives anything away for free. If it were to increase its support for Russia, or indeed in exchange for the support it's already given, what do you expect it to be looking for in return?
Your underlying principle, Jonathan, is correct. I was about to say, well, wash your mouth, Jonathan Tepperman. Why would you actually believe that the Chinese wouldn't give anything away for free? But you and I have been around the racetrack a few times before, and we've seen these things happen. And so as a general principle, you're right. But from the Chinese perspective, geopolitically, they have most of that which they need from Russia. And therefore, they do not want Putin's Russia to fail. Remember, if you're sitting in Beijing, what the China-Russia relationship means today is the fundamental inversion of global strategic realities as they existed back in 1972, 50 years ago, when Nixon and Kissinger went off to meet Mao and Zhou Enlai to make common cause against the common Soviet threat. That was the organizing principle for U.S. China relations effectively between about 1969 and about 1989. And then progressively through the 90s, the beginnings of the normalization of Russia-China after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You then saw it actually moving in the sort of direction which we've discussed already. And what China benefits from is to have the Russians out there around the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, causing the Americans grief wherever possible in an inevitable Russian sort of way, partnering with the Chinese in the UN Security Council. Very few UN Security Council resolutions where they do not vote together. On top of that, a increasingly useful and reliable source of energy imports. China wants to preserve the assets it's already gained, because I think the deep political reality is that whereas the last time there was this level of Sino-Soviet collaboration between 49 and 59, Russia was numero uno, and China was definitely the non-dominant partner. Now it's flipped, and the code language buried within all these communiques is that Russia has now accepted its secondary position. China is therefore happy with all the above.
So, as I've alluded to earlier, one of the challenges that Western policymakers and the rest of us face now with China is that reporting in the country and on the country has become so difficult. You have unusual access to the Chinese leadership, so you can see it more clearly than the rest of us. Is there any internal disagreement at the moment over President Xi Jinping's support for Putin and his foreign policy more generally? Is there even space for internal disagreement in today's China, given the way that Xi has consolidated power? And if there were disagreement or dissent, how would we know? What are the signs you look for?
Yeah. Both for you and your audience, Jonathan, I should be candid about the fact that my own direct insight into fault lines or differing positions within the Chinese leadership have been undermined by the COVID reality. I haven't been to the country for 2 years. I just want to be frank about that. Very few people have, which creates a problem of its own nature in terms of the reality of the common information base or the non-common information base. So secondly, what those of us who are lifelong China analysts are forced to do is to return to the ancient alchemy and deep magical crafts, otherwise called China watching, or the Chinese equivalent of Kremlinology, where we look carefully at a daily analysis of the Chinese official media in order to ascertain fault lines within media describing different positions. And so what we have deduced is that there is, using those tools, is that there is some disagreement within the leadership on Xi Jinping being all the way with Vladimir Putin. In fact, there was one public piece produced only a week or so ago by a guy called Hu Wei, who's a senior researcher at the Chinese State Council Research Office, saying that this decision to fully embrace the Russian position departs from what should have been not just nominal, but real Chinese neutrality on this dispute. And furthermore, that because of the Russian action in Ukraine has now assisted the United States to rally its allies around a common cause and the rest of the world around a common cause, including the G77, that according to this critique, the Chinese position has been utterly undermining of China's strategic interests in the world. Furthermore, there's a report in the last 24 hours on social media that former Premier Zhu Rongji who was the premier under Jiang Zemin back in the period from memory 1992 to about 2002. I stand to be corrected on the exact dates. Has also come out internally in opposition to the current position taken by Xi Jinping on Putin and Russia. What we do know about the Chinese system is that most officials live in fear and trembling as they go in to meet the emperor to explain candidly and objectively how his decisions are being reviewed around the world and being deliverer of bad news. So therefore, people tend to trim their sails when they go in, which is why President Biden, in my judgment, has done exactly the right thing in speaking directly to President Xi, as only other heads of government can do in the current circumstances. I think the final thing to say on this question of unity, disunity, Jonathan, is if you look across the other headwinds, political headwinds, which Xi Jinping faces between now and the 20th Party Congress, due to be held in November this year, which will decide formally on whether Xi Jinping is extended for another 5-year period, and in my judgment, if he is, effectively become leader for life, you see a range of other divisions on economic policy settings, on pandemic management, as well as the wisdom itself of Xi breaching the 2-term limit put in by Deng Xiaoping to prevent a return to the Maoist autocracy of the past. There are divisions on all these questions. The question, though, as you look at Chinese internal Politburo politics, is what becomes the catalytic or galvanizing event which would cause all these disparate elements of dissent within the system to come together? And the only one I can really point to is either the pandemic really getting out of control. At present, it's partly out of control because it's jumped the border from Hong Kong into Shenzhen, now in Changchun and Northeast. And we now have tens of thousands of cases across, I think, 70 different cities within the country. This presents a massive domestic legitimacy problem for Xi Jinping, given he has boasted for 2 years that we commies have got this under control. It's those dumb capitalists in the United States and elsewhere who let the market rip, as it were, and we see what failed as a result. That, or I think much more poignantly and sharply, would be if you were to see the political demise of Vladimir Putin in Moscow because of perceived mismanagement of the war in Ukraine, the reverberations back into Chinese domestic politics of Putin falling would be profound. I can't predict the outcome, but you would then have, on my judgment, a highly unstable period leading into the 20th Party Congress in November.
I want to remind our audience members to please start sending in your questions on using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to weave them into the questions that I have, and I'm going to start with one audience question that picks up on something you've just said. Is there any chance that Xi actually won't have his term extended at the party conference?
Yes, there is. It's a possibility, but at this stage, it's not a probability. The probability is because Xi Jinping has been so proficient at power consolidation over the last 9 years that, frankly, you would need an extraordinary coalescence of events of the type we've just been discussing, which would bring all this to a head. The mechanism normally used is a very untidy set of leadership retreat meetings at Beidaihe, the leadership's beachside retreat location, held every August before major party meetings in October, November. And then secondly, on top of that, the other mechanism, which has now been used 4 times since the end of the Cultural Revolution, an expanded Politburo meeting in order to execute political change. So the mechanisms exist. The Congress ultimately is the decision-making body, but you'd need to see the likes of former General Secretary Jiang Zemin, who is now almost as old as Methuselah, and former General Secretary Hu Jintao, who carries much less clout within the system, but other senior leaders, such as Zhu Rongji, who is also very old, re-enter the fray because they had judged that these matters had been taken too far to the extreme. So again, I say it's possible. that if I was a betting man as of this date, the 18th of March, 2022, I would say Xi Jinping's at least a 70% probability and probably a 75% probability of securing his re-elect. But the variables are as I've just described.
So I want to follow up on that and ask the following question. One of the things I think the Ukraine crisis reveals in Russia is the fundamental flaw of autocracies versus democracies, which is that because dictators can remain in power for so long, they eventually, inevitably start to lose their marbles. Their judgment starts to get worse and worse because they surround themselves with yes men. They don't get good information. They don't get challenged. For many years, China was an exceptional autocracy and seemed to be avoiding this pattern. But as we've discussed already, Xi has so effectively dismantled so many of the features that once made the Chinese system special, like term limits, collective decision-making, some degree of meritocracy, that I wonder if he is becoming more susceptible to the profound degeneration of judgment that we've seen with Putin. Xi and Putin are about the same age, but Xi has only been in power half as long as Putin has. But as he spends more time in the role, do you expect China's decision-making under him to get worse?
I think the key thing on this question is to reflect carefully on what the Chinese would describe internally as bad emperor syndrome. Chinese imperial history is replete with examples of good emperors and bad emperors. They form part of the historiography, if you like, of Chinese political power. We go back to the Qing dynasty, for example, good emperors, people like Kangxi and Qianlong, who was good Confucians, worked 26 hours a day, burnt the candle at both ends, and were dogmatic in their discipline, but also mindful, this is the key point, of keeping their doors open to imperial advice from the imperial counselors. So that's China's style of, shall we say, history of resilient authoritarianism, which is certainly a pattern of a dominant leader, but one served ably by officials who could provide correction to imperial decisions and often put their life on the line to do so. I'm not sure the current Chinese political system sees a lot of such professional heroism on the part of the bureaucratic class. So I think that's a danger. I think the second danger, which is something which Xi Jinping shares with Vladimir Putin, is that they both obviously see themselves as, quote, men of history. I don't know about you, Jonathan, but whenever I am in a meeting with a political leader, and I get the feeling that they, quote, see themselves as men of history, unquote, I want to run screaming from the room because any objective reading of history causes us to be concerned about leaders who believe that it's been their divine mandate or their dialectical mandate to bring about radical political change. So I think that's a second feature. But I'll say this about Xi Jinping, is that like Kangxi and like Qianlong, he has a formidable work ethic. He is a formidably disciplined mind. He is quite well read and therefore can choose to secure his own sources of information if he wishes. Furthermore, he's a formidable Machiavellian. And the way in which I have seen him consolidate power in the last 9 years is breathtaking. The elimination of would-be opponents from the Standing Committee of the Politburo, from the Politburo itself, from the Central Military Commission, from the Public Security Bureau. That takes more than your average dose of chutzpah. And these are not just been corruption cases. Corruption has been used in each case to justify a pre-existing political reason for the removal of these individuals. So I think in terms of resilient authoritarianism, never underestimate Xi Jinping's work ethic, never underestimate his level of professional and physical discipline, never underestimate having observed Chinese court politics all his life and seen his father fall 2 or 3 times as a consequence of court politics going wrong for him. Never underestimate Xi Jinping being 1 step, 2 steps, or even 3 steps ahead of where his internal opponents may think they are.
That's fascinating, and I suppose either reassuring or not, depending on what your perspective is. Let me bring in some audience questions now. Jim Cook asks this question that I think has been at the forefront of so many minds in the last 3+ weeks now, which is how will the events in Ukraine affect China's view toward Taiwan and possible military action against Taiwan?
I think I say this with some respect, but in the United States, there is too much of a predisposition to draw immediate parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan. My judgment is that Xi Jinping's political timetable for recovering Taiwan will be determined internally and will be shaped by 2 factors. One, when the balance of power changes in the Taiwan Straits decisively to advantage China over America plus Taiwan, or even America plus Taiwan plus Japan. And whereas a lot of the desktop military exercises in the last couple of decades have the Chinese winning, it's not always a decisive win. And if you've read Sun Tzu's Art of War, the opening line says, "War is a great matter of state, not to be taken lightly. If you lose the war, you lose the state." Something which will be resonating in Chinese ears at the moment in terms of Vladimir's forays in Ukraine. So for those reasons, that's the first thing they're waiting for. And they don't believe they've got a big enough military buffer just now. They'd like a much bigger one, which is why I think it's more likely that they'll feel militarily prepared by decades end rather than decades beginning. The second is most critical, and that is at which point the Chinese believe, through their economy becoming big enough, bold enough, and ugly enough, that they no longer fear or have any basis for fear of US and allied sanctioned financial and economic sanctions against them, which would inevitably flow in China's view were they to resort to military means to invade Taiwan. And so the Chinese are not there yet because, as we've discussed before, the renminbi is not traded. The global economy is still done by and large in US dollars, particularly the financial system. All the financial plumbing is in US dollars. Look at the operation of the SWIFT system, from which the Russians have now been excluded by and large. So the Chinese, if you look at the fierce paddling of duck's feet beneath the water at the moment, in the Chinese system, it is moving towards a point where it is maximally resilient financially and economically against those actions flowing from a military decision to take Taiwan. So I see, therefore, that being the second factor which pushes Xi Jinping's timetable out towards decade's end and the beginning of the next decade rather than any time soon.
What do you think the key lessons that the Taiwanese leadership is learning, are learning from this crisis?
I would hope the key lesson that the Taiwanese learn is the reason we're having this discussion at all today, Jonathan, is because the Ukrainians have managed a massive indigenous national defense.
Right.
Because leaving aside the curious nature of the Taiwan Relations Act, which governs American military supplies for Taiwan, there is no existing mutual defense pact between the Republic of China and Taiwan on the one hand, and the United States of America on the other, as exists between America's other treaty allies, whether it's the Philippines, Japan, the ROK, or Australia. So I think that's an important factor. So secondly, I know repeated American administrations have wanted to pull their hair out, literally over Taiwan's indolence in making maximum preparedness for its own national defense. This, if the Taiwanese are looking at through razor-sharp eyes, should underline the fact that the world ain't going to come to Taiwan's assistance quickly if Taiwan folds rapidly in the case of a Chinese military invasion. Which brings us to the third point: the nature, the quantum and the quality of the Taiwanese military investment in items of defensive materiel, which are designed to conduct asymmetric warfare against an incoming invasion force, rather than to match the Chinese ship for ship on the Taiwan Straits. There's a huge, long-standing internal debate between the admirals of the Taiwanese system and those who actually understand where contemporary military strategy actually lies, which is asymmetric warfare. Look at the Ukraine. So for those reasons, therefore, the principal lessons I would have thought on the part of both the DPP, the Democratic Progress Party, which is the ruling party in Taiwan now, and the KMT would be to look long and hard at two things. One, that military action launched by a large power is a bloody business. Two, your prospects of generating global sympathy, support, and perhaps in Taiwan's case, active military engagement by the United States will depend in large part on your ability to withstand the blitzkrieg, withstand the efforts for early regime decapitation, the two cornerstones of Putin's failed strategy against Kiev so far.
I want to bring in another audience question, which you may have touched on already, but I think it's worth calling out, which is, if the war in Ukraine continues to drag on and the humanitarian toll rises, what are the chances that this could affect Chinese decision-making?
I wish I could say to the person raising this question that this would distress the Marxist-Leninist core of the Chinese system. It's unlikely to. Xi Jinping's ultimate view, notwithstanding the text of the Chinese readout from today's meeting with President Biden about we need to avoid conflict and war. I have not wanted to see conflict in Ukraine. None of us have. And the United States and China must work not just to aid global economic development, but to sustain global peace. Notwithstanding all of that, remember, China still hasn't described this as an invasion, condemned it as an invasion, or condemned the war crimes, which as a matter of empirical record are being committed each day through the deliberate targeting of civilian facilities. This is a direct violation of the Geneva Conventions. Geneva Conventions were introduced into the international community by and large between 1948 and I think 52. Geneva Convention 1, 2, 3, and 4, to dealing with the conduct of armed forces against civilian populations. This is a daily violation, but we do not see Chinese condemnation of those violations either. So I am moved to say that whatever sympathy may be expressed in parts of Chinese social media towards the loss of life in Ukraine, and whatever the Chinese Foreign Ministry may give us the official readout so far of the meeting with President Biden on the horrors of war, the bottom line is war crimes have now been being committed for at least the last 2 weeks in Ukraine. All democracies have been calling us out. China has not. And so I'm not sure that, given based on what the Ukrainians have published recently, that there have been some 7,000 civilian deaths. Maybe I've got the figure wrong, maybe 10,000, maybe more. There is a magic turning point whereby the China says enough is enough. Remember, China supported Russia to the hilt in the raising of Aleppo. People perhaps forget that in the Security Council, in the United Nations, and elsewhere, and in the Human Rights Council in Geneva.
Another member of our audience, Jonathan Stern, asks about another thing which he wonders whether it could affect the Chinese decision about whether or not to intervene or put pressure on the Russians, and that's Russia's possible use of weapons of mass destruction, which, as you know, has become a very live issue.
Yes, there's a quite a detailed debate in the corridors of power in Washington about this question now, as you would imagine, because such an escalation by Putin cannot be ruled out. Remember, Russia doubled down in support of its Syrian ally, notwithstanding Bashar al-Assad's decision to deploy chemical weapons against his own people back in 2013. So we need to understand that this does not represent the level of horror within the Russian military and political system that it does for the rest of us. But the question goes to how would the Chinese react? I think a Russian escalation to using weapons of mass destruction would be one of the factors which would push the Chinese towards a position of picking up the telephone in a fundamental way, because whereas China itself has turned a blind eye to what happened in Syria by supporting the Russian position on Syria, when you are both in substance and in perception seen to be Russia's principal supporter in the world at present, notwithstanding nominal neutrality, I don't believe the body politic in Beijing could readily stomach being associated with a WMD attack. I think they would see that as providing too much collateral damage for China's global reputational and European reputational interests.
I promised your team I would have you out by 2:45. So let me ask one final question, and I apologize to all the members of our audience who didn't get to hear their questions answered. You've already talked about what would be the worst case scenario for how this war ends from the Chinese perspective. What do you think the best case scenario is? How would they most like this crisis to end?
From Xi Jinping's perspective, it would be for Putin to prevail sufficiently militarily in Ukraine that there was a defensible military outcome, which in turn sustains Vladimir Putin in office and reinforces his political position as the great, Russian patriot, etc. As I said, the underlying Chinese interest is preserve the Russia relationship, maintain a benign border with the Russians, use the Russians as a global turbocharging force in support of Chinese interests by distracting the Americans in the Middle East and Europe and God knows where else. And to do that, you've got to have someone you can pick up the phone to in Moscow and collaborate with. And this is something which people often don't consider, and I'll conclude on this, Jonathan. If Xi Jinping was to pick up that telephone too early or too demonstrably, let alone in response to Ukrainian or other pressure, the possibility under those circumstances of a fracture emerging between Russia and China is real. So if you have already expended considerable political and diplomatic capital in support of Putin and the Russian position over Ukraine, I'm not sure that the calculus in Beijing, in the brutal realism which forms part of the decision-making process, would say, well, we're just going to cash in all our chips on that, didn't work out well, and we're going to pivot back to America. It just doesn't work that way. The strategic decision about decoupling from America has been taken. That's been taken over the last several years. Strategic competition with America is real. It's unfolding at every level. The Russia question is one of Can we preserve Putin and the Russian Federation in support of China's global project in relation to the United States? Or does he become simply too hot to handle and we look at some other type of intervention and possibly, but with great difficulty, some post-Putin Russia to deal with? As I said earlier, Jonathan, and I'll conclude on this, if Vladimir Putin was to fall anytime soon, I know enough about the political alchemy and the chemistry of Chinese leadership politics to know that the internal critique then against Xi Jinping would be formidable. You put all your equities behind this guy. You went beyond the normal tolerance levels of the Chinese state and the way in which we would conduct ourselves normally on Russia questions, which is keep the relationship in the broad okay, but don't go too far and don't put all your eggs in one basket. Well, you did that, Xi Jinping, despite our best counsel, and it's all blown up in your face, and this guy's no longer in office, and we've backed the loser. That, as I said, would be a very untidy development in terms of leadership politics come this November at the 20th Party Congress. Thanks very much, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I know today is a very busy day for you, so I'm really grateful for your time. I want to thank everyone in our audience for joining us as well, and remind you to please subscribe if you're not already at octavian.substack.com. You can also give a gift subscription, and I can't think of a better St. Patrick's Day or Purim present for anyone than an Octavian subscription. So please buy them now and often. We'll see you all again very soon. Thanks again to Kevin and to all of you. Bye-bye.